Good evening or good afternoon, everybody. We'll be having people joining with us in a moment. Really excited to start this session today. It's the last day of Black History Month. I hope everybody had a fantastic Black History Month, that you managed to get to some great events. And today we're going to be talking all about our history and our stories. Welcome, everybody. So what we're going to do, just whilst we're waiting for a few more people to join, we've got some questions for you. And if you could just put your name and where you're from and your answers to these questions. So number one, why do you think Black British history figures are not well known in the UK? And we're going to talk about a survey which was recently conducted, which very much gives some evidence towards this. And two, which are the top three Black British figures that you think should be studied in British schools? I mean, of course, there's more than three, but which would be your top three? And then finally, should the study of Black British history be compulsory in British schools, and why? So welcome to those of you who are joining, who've put a welcome in the chat. Great to have you with us. So I'll start having a quick look at the responses in the chat as well. But thank you for those of you who have responded. Welcome, Pamela. And welcome, Matthew. Thank you for joining us. It'd be great to see which of the Black British historical figures you think should be studied in schools, and just some of your thoughts around why Black British figures are not more well known. As somebody said, that because it's just not taught in many schools, or not many schools until recently. Lovely to have some of the colleagues from TeachFirst who I also work for. And a very international audience here. I can see that we've got attendees here from Dubai, from Luxembourg. Thank you for taking the time to join with us today. There's some great suggestions here to ensure that we study the life of Diane Abbott, Bernie Grant, and Bill Morris. Thank you, Emma, for your response. So yes, it does appear that there's a lack of teaching of Black British history in schools. Also, yes, important to talk about the bias towards Eurocentric and white-focused historical figures. We are going to talk a bit about Mary Seacole later on in the session. Queen Charlotte, of course, now becoming much more well-known after the Netflix series of the same name. And integrating the history into the current curriculum, very, very important as well. Great to see the mention of Walter Tull. I know that he was a very well-known World War I officer as well as a footballer. There's some really great suggestions. Thank you so much. Keep those coming in. Claudia Jones, most definitely. I know that many of you will be familiar with Claudia Jones and her impact on what is now the Notting Hill Carnival, one of the biggest carnivals in the world. And I would definitely have to agree that unlike the Welsh curriculum, for example, where Black British history is part of the statutory requirements. We don't have that here in England, and perhaps that would make a really big difference if that was part of the curriculum. So thank you, everyone that is just joining us. And we're going to move on. Could we have the next slide, please? And do take some time to have a look at the curriculum as well. So in a few moments, we're going to be talking to the writer of The Nurse's Tale. But before we do that, I'm going to just introduce you to our team today, our panelists. So with us today, we have Emily Folorunsho, who has been teaching history for 7 years across Key Stage 3 and 5, and has led in terms of being a practitioner, a specialist leader of education. And she's definitely going to be talking a lot about the book that she's co-authored, the award-winning Collins Black British History Key Stage 3 resource pack. And you can see a picture of that on the screen. And we also are really delighted to have with us the author of A Nurse's Tale, Ola Awonubi, and born in London to Nigerian parents, an avid reader, an MA in creative writing at the University of East London, and her short stories have won first prize in both the National World of Colour competition. We also are going to hear much, much more about her amazing book. We actually had a book club session about this at work, and it was really, really well received, A Nurse's Tale. So welcome to all of you. And then I am Joanne Benjamin-Lewis, based in Birmingham. I'm a former school leader, head of English, and I now train teachers. I'm a contributor to 3 of the HarperCollins textbooks, Who We Are, Through Our Eyes, and All of Us. Resources aim to integrate inclusion and diversity. We focus on representation, and we've gone across the Key Stage 3, 4, and 5 curriculum. So welcome, everybody. And again, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us here today. It's absolutely fantastic to have so many people with us on the call. So we're going to hand over to Emily, who's going to start us off with just some really insightful and thoughts and questions with Ola, all about her work. So hi, Emily, how are you doing?
I'm good, thank you. Thank you for having me, and thank you for being here, Ola. So in terms of A Nurse's Tale, how did you come up with the idea to, turn your great aunt's life into a story, and why a fictional retelling?
Okay. Princess Ademola actually isn't my great aunt. HarperCollins suggested that whether I wanted to write about this forgotten Nigerian nurse, basically, who had come over to Nigeria, came over from Nigeria to Working Guys Hospital during the Second World War. The grandniece idea comes into it because I decided, after finding out about her history, I found out a lot about her, but not as much as I would have liked. And I thought to myself, in order to contrast it a bit, I would give her a grandniece in 80 years' time. So what I wanted to do was to show what life had been like during the Second World War, and what it would like if she had this fictitious grandniece who showed up in England in 2019. So we are not related at all, apart from the fact that we both come from Nigeria. But I would like to say she was my great auntie, but she isn't. So I'm not her grandniece. No, okay. But HarperCollins came up with the idea and said, "But I want to write about this Nigerian nurse who was called, I think, the Princess Adenrele, and what I want to write about her." And she became the subject of the book.
Wow. And why the fictional retelling of the character?
Funnily enough, I lived in Nigeria for 17 years, and I never knew anything about her, which is really sad. And then about 25 years after coming back here, I started seeing her story on Facebook, funnily enough, and people were asking for anyone who had any information about this interview she'd done with the BBC in 1941 or two. And I didn't know I'd be asked to write about her about 3 years later. So I started sharing it on my page, thinking that maybe if I could find any of my Nigerian contacts, someone might know someone might know anything about her. But then it all fell flat, basically. I know the Association of Junior Historians were trying to get information, but they couldn't get anywhere either. And then fast forward to 2020, HarperCollins then contacted me to write about the same person. And that was it, really. And the reason why I wanted to make a contrast between what the life she lived and the life we now live here was that there was just so much richness in that, and just to make the story more rich, really.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. So I'm just going to pass on to Joanne.
I think we have a slide with some of the photographs of the real princess. It'd be great to just see those. Wow. And so you put out some, and I think I saw this actually. You put out a kind of looking for some more information about her via social media. So what happened then? Did people get in touch with you, and how did you actually go about researching the book? Because I think people would be really interested in that if they, kind of have the nugget of an idea of doing some research. How do you go about it?
Okay, regarding her, there's a page on Facebook called the Nigerian Nostalgic page, and people share a lot of stuff about old pictures of their parents. So you've even got people who've lost contact with relatives going on that page and trying to find each other on there. So I put a post on there with a few pictures. Does anyone know anything about her? And we found her sister. They're quite a prominent family in Nigeria. Her brother was the first Attorney General of Nigeria, and you've got a street named after him in a place called I think Ikoyi in Lagos. That's what happened in her particular case. I tried to find as much information as I could. I couldn't find as much as I would have wanted, but where I did go to look, I went to online British Library, old newspapers, so you've got all that online as well. Found out a bit about her in The Sun, something about 1936, where she was described as a, quote, a dusky beauty. She was also described as a, for some funny reason, I think some of her patients used to call her fairy. I don't know why. I think when it comes to historical fiction, you've got to look in old books, old newspapers, British Library, old magazines, old historical books and things like that. The fact that we both happen to come from, the same area, that helped a little bit. So in terms of understanding the culture, when you're writing about a real life character, you've got to try your best to do your due diligence to try and find out as much as you can about her. And then you use, like, take the example, she's a nurse. So I had to think to myself, what would a nurse, what's the daily procedure, what's the daily life of a nurse? And that was in the book as well. And the rest was basically 1940s. So I happen to be a fan of anything to do with the Second World War. Why? Because I was raised by an English family, and they lived during the Second World War. So my foster mom, at that time I went to live with her in her 50s, she was in her 50s, and they spoke about the Second World War a lot. So I think it was just, it's kind of like a romantic case, and a lot of people of that age in their memory. So she spoke about it a lot, and that kind of, made me start to always have this kind of interest about it. With writing this book, I read lots of books about the Second World War. And I watched lots of TV as well. So you've got, I've always been a fan of Miss Marple, and anything to do with the Second World War. That was just to get some kind of idea of what life was like during the Second World War. Rationing, there was no food. The fact that they lived from day to day without knowing what was going to happen to them. And that all showed, you can get that just by watching the films, watching the programs. How did they speak? So obviously, our language has changed, and the way, also in terms of our relationships as well, the way how men and women behave towards each other there and then is quite different. Our language, the food we ate, things like that. So it was just trying to do all my research to make sure it was as true as possible, because what you want people to do is to read the book and to be able to connect with it and for it to be as authentic as possible. So I use my, the sense of smell, taste, see, to give people a kind of panoramic view of what it would have been like to kind of have a sense of the lifestyle of the people who lived there. And then when you now add the, her peculiar circumstances of being a woman of color at that particular point in time, in a time of a lot of social or political upheaval, then you've got an interesting story, I think.
Incredibly, really, really interesting story. And I mean, the research that you did, obviously watching TV, reading newspapers. So it's not just the factual bits, as it were. You kind of looked at, what life was like. The prejudice is very, very, very keenly drawn, I would like to say, in terms of you really get a sense of what it must have been like to be a woman of color, stationed in England, working in England during the Second World War. Yeah. So her personality, though, was that, how did you get a sense of, what her actual personality was like? I mean, are there people living who knew what she was like as a person?
I think probably her younger sister might have an idea, but trying to get access to her sister to find out, that wouldn't be easy for me. So I had to write this based on, I had to give the character a sense of strength. So that was all me. I don't know what she was like, but I had to think to myself, for her to have come to a country she didn't know in the middle of in the 1930s, she must have had somewhat, she must have been a person who had her own quality of personal strength. While I did my research, I came across a letter that a Jamaican lady had written to Winston Churchill. And the letter said that she was quite appalled that during a recent bomb raid, once in those days, once there was a bomb raid, everybody ran to the Anderson shelters, to the bomb shelters. And she said she was quite appalled that during a recent bomb raid, she was not allowed to get into the shelter of the rest of the people on the street.
Wow. So
the fact that, the bombs were raining down and tearing into people and blowing them to pieces, and people were huddled for safety and she had been pushed out, and it took the intervention of, one of the air, they had wardens going around to allow people to actually let her get in there. And she wrote a letter to Winston Churchill about it. And I read the letter to give you a kind of sense of the kind of society, that even though people that were coming over and being part of the war effort, there was still that kind of prejudice. And things were much better in this country than they were in the States, where they'd also sent men, to fight in the battle, but on the ground, there were still lots of racial problems. So I thought to myself that she must have been a very strong woman. And if she was a midwife, it would be a lot of just get on and go with it, So I put all that. I like writing stories about strong characters, and a strong woman, and that's it. So I infused her with that character, and I thought to myself, for her to have come over, she would have been a strong person anyway.
Yeah. Yeah, to have gone through all that she went through,
Yeah.
she would have to have been a very determined, very determined person.
Yeah.
So if somebody has an idea, sort of a similar idea, let us say, to write about a historical figure or somebody in their family, what advice would you give them in terms of, kind of going about the research? Other than some of the things that you've mentioned, what kind of barriers are there? What hurdles will you need to get over? What advice would you give?
I mean, I'd say do your research, speak to people who knew them. If they're a member of your family, then then looking through pictures also helped as well. These aren't the only pictures I've got. I managed to find about 10 different pictures.
Right.
By looking online and going into old newspapers, and that were pictures of her and the rest of the royal family. So from a picture, you can really glean a lot. From a picture, I was able to find out other members of her family, about her dad, about his wives and things like that, the kind of place where they were living. I actually got to, when I went to Nigeria, I decided to go to Abeokuta, which was her ancestral home, to get a sense of what the place, obviously it's now 2023, but to get a sense of what the palace looked like. The old palace is still there. Be prepared to do some research. If you can, travel to the actual place where you think the thing took place, because when you're doing historical fiction, you are taking us back in time to that place. Quite atmospheric. So if you're writing a story about Napoleon and a war he had, you've got to take us back to the battlefield. I want to smell the blood. I want to smell the horses. I want to hear the horses bearing down on me. I want to make it, so to make it all very, very real. So you do your research. If it involves travel, do that. Read books about that particular era. Realize that everything will change. So it's a whole different world. The language will change. Some of the slangs or the way we speak to each other will not feature in there. So if you're writing a book, you wouldn't say something like "you get me" or "yeah, you get this," or you won't.
It's got to be authentic.
In terms of if you're relationships between men and women, it's very, very different. The way how men related to women and vice versa. A lot of the women were stay-at-home moms. So like you wouldn't start writing about someone who would wake up in the morning and going to work, especially if writing about something in the 1930s or 1940s. It was after the Second World War that more women started going out and having a career. So you need to have an understanding of those times. You can get that by watching films, by reading widely about that particular topic. The British Library is also a very good resource as well. The V&A, I wrote about the Second World War, so that's also the Imperial War Museum as well. And then the National Archives has got a lot of stuff. So take, for example, if you wanted to write about a particular family who lived in Walthamstow in the 1700s, there are libraries there's a National Archives that will tell you who was in that house about 300 years ago.
Wow.
I think David Olusoga did something similar where he went to a house in Bristol and decided to look back at the history of the families who lived in that house. Just prepare to really get your imagination thinking, because there's some things you will know about this character and there's some things you won't know that you're going to have to put flesh on the bones of. As long as those things you're talking about are not salacious.
Okay, yeah.
Then you can write the book. So you can't write. There's certain things you can't write about a character. You can write about the things that they would have been likely to do, but you can't say. Can't suddenly have them off having an affair with someone. If that didn't happen in real life. So you've got to think of other ways to make a story while still sticking with the basic facts, which is what I've tried my best to do here. So yeah, National Archives, museums, things like that. And just become a student of history. Because if you're not a student of history, you don't love history.
It's going to be challenging then if you don't.
Yeah. So I something that I love. So it helped.
And a bit of detective work as well, by the sounds of things.
Yeah.
Trying to piece it all together. And you did a fantastic job, a really, really fantastic job. So I'm going to hand over to Emily.
Thank you, Ola. I was just listening, really, attentively in terms of what you said, and it's so interesting, the research and the hard work you put into piecing this together to make it authentic and vibrant. Last week, I believe on the 26th, The Guardian put out an article which highlighted a lack of knowledge about Black British history among Britons. I don't know if you've seen that. It's quite disappointing to read, and more than half of those that were surveyed couldn't name a single Black British historical figure. So why, based on what you know and your observations, why do you think a lot of people still don't know about Black British historical figures?
I think sometimes it starts from the educational system, because growing up here, what I learned a lot about was Henry VIII and then Queen Elizabeth I, and then went to Nigeria, and in some initially it was more or less the same lines. Although things changed, and then I started finding out about Mali Empire, about the princes and the princess of South Africa and different things like that. So it does start from an educational system, which is formed based on a kind of colonial setup. Secondly, why do we know so much about Florence Nightingale? Because there have been plays about her and so many films about her.
Yeah.
So this is where creators get involved in it. So if we started writing more books and having more plays about characters, about people of color, then more people would know about her. Because what's the easiest way of trying to get something like this into the consciousness of people who go to school? Then you're going to have to engage with them through the media, through anything to do using this phone. Whether that's podcast, whether that's plays, whether that's something on TV, whether that's something on Netflix. And that was done with Queen Charlotte. If not, that's how we got to know about her. I mean, she wasn't someone that we knew that much about her like that. So the more books we write, that would also help more people to know, not just people of color, but just genuinely. Because I remember with this book, one of the reviews I got was someone from the States got back to me and said she had no idea that people from the Caribbean actually played any part in the Second World War. And I was quite surprised, but she didn't know.
Wow. My follow-up question was going to be, how could we change that? But I think you touched on, the education system and creators playing their part as well. I don't know if you have anything else to add about how a change could be implemented so that next time a survey is done, it's not going to be these startling figures.
Well, I think that there needs to be some amendments and definite updates to the history curriculum, definitely, especially in this country, because to have a kind of understanding, because I'm on social media a lot, and this is Black History Month, and for some reason I can't really understand. It's just brought out a lot of pushback from some members of the wider community, and also, and I think that's because people don't really understand history, and what you don't understand, you're bound to repeat. So, and then we had Three Little Birds come out. That's this program on ITV1 with Lenny Henry, which talks about his mom's experiences coming from the Caribbean into England during the Windrush era. This is the first time I've ever seen something like that put on primetime TV. Now, that it has a big way of getting people who have some contrary views to look at it and realize, oh, let me look at that differently.
Yeah.
We did invite them over. They're not, and that just contrasts and negates the view that some have that they were economic migrants. And so the more the writers get going, the more the people get stuff put into theatre, into TV and things like that, the more you begin to challenge those kind of views. And then, then that's backed up with a change to the school curriculum as well. then you're getting people beginning to change their mindset about certain things, and not just Black history. You've got Asian history as well and things like that. That would change, especially with the kind of rhetoric we're hearing nowadays as well, in terms of, you know, people using sentences like hordes and floods and stuff like this, kind of reminiscent of Enoch Powell in the 1960s. And it's the last thing we need now. And I think history, when it's researched really well and backed up by figures, people can't really, you can't argue against it. And that was why I tried my best to do as much research as I could, because I found that people engaged with the story are more ready to, you know, see what happened to the people who come over than me actually, you know, having a one-to-one to them and telling them.
Yeah, definitely agree. Yeah, definitely agree. Thank you.
I really loved Three Little Birds. I haven't watched it all. I think you can watch it on ITVX. But I was lucky enough to go to a preview screening and Lenny Henry was there. And just hearing him talking about how he was, you know, when he was younger, listening to his mom's stories and his aunties and, you know, all of that history that was all just in his head, just kind of milling around, and then feeling that now was the right time to use that creatively. And I think, you know, your book is a really great example of that, how it doesn't have to be somebody that is a well-known historical figure. It could be, you know, a relative, it could be a friend, somebody that you know, you feel is really inspiring or would have a great story, and kind of using that and putting that together. So I think, yes, absolutely right, that it is definitely the right time to be able to home in on some of these stories. So in our textbook, we've got a Key Stage 5 textbook, which I know is on the screen, all of us. So A-level in particular, there are 2 stories or 2 non-fiction extracts. And one of them is about a very, very well-known nurse, Mary Seacole. And it comes from her autobiography, 1857, actually. And she's talking about the Crimean War. And it really does resonate very much with your piece as well, because she talks about the fact that she wasn't welcomed, even though she was actually putting her life on the line to support the war effort, that many of her colleagues, the patients, did not want her to be supportive. She particularly mentions Florence Nightingale, and that she had to have an interview with one of Florence Nightingale's companions. And she gave me the reply, she says, and I read in her face that even if there had been a vacancy, I would not have been chosen to fill it. And just having that dawn upon her that even when you're willing to die, put your life on the line, like so many of the soldiers who came from the West Indies, came from Africa and India, that above all else, it was the colour of their skin, which was prominent, not the fact that they were willing to serve. And as you rightly mentioned, not that, you know, the Caribbean migrants were invited. So we had Enoch Powell, ironically enough, going to the Caribbean to recruit, you know, Black Caribbeans to come and work in the UK. And we know the story. And then coming here, not being able to find accommodation, finding that your qualifications that you had back home were not recognised, and you were then demoted to auxiliary nursing, let us say, or you know, working in factories, that kind of thing. So we have within our textbooks, you know, extracts that will very much stimulate that level of discussion. And of course, it is absolutely crucial at this moment because of the language that we are hearing being used to describe those who have come from abroad. And we also have, and I've actually always been fascinated by this gentleman. So Ignatius Sancho, who was the first person of African descent to vote in Britain, that he was a writer, a composer, part of high society at the time. And it was really interesting to read about him, a businessman as well, somebody who really courted high society, and how that gives a particular piece of information which a lot of people don't know about, because people think that anybody Black came here on the Windrush. And there was none of us here before that. And so his story and what he went through, and the fact that he was able to, rise to such high-ranking status within society is a really, really powerful extract as well. And in our other textbook, Who We Are, there's a piece from looking at the ivory bangle lady. So it's talking about Black Romans. So again, just dispelling myths that there was anybody who was Black and brown in Britain before Windrush. So very, very important that we remember these historical figures, and like yourself, we could creatively use their life, use the history to just give that bit more of information, like you said, the kind of flesh on the bones. So when people write a play, they write a film script, there's a work of fiction as well, that all of these things just raise the consciousness and raise people's understanding of history and really ignite their interest in it.
Yes.
So I'm going to hand over to Emily, who is going to just give us a bit more information about some amazing Black historical figures who could really give a real kind of impetus in terms of sparking people's interest in this area.
Hi everyone. I'm just going to whiz through this because of time. We already discussed this article, so if you could go to the next slide, please. So as you know, the Black History Month theme for this year is saluting our sisters. Therefore, I thought I should highlight Black British figures, female figures in history. I'm just going to mostly focus on one, who is Fanny Eaton, the Victorian Muse. So in the 21st century, as we know, there's been an ongoing debate about the representation of Black people in advertising and the fashion industry. Historically, it is rare to see Black faces on magazine covers or leading fashion campaigns due to belief that they were less commercially attractive, especially in the Victorian period, with the assumption that white consumers had more spending power. However, in the wake of the Black Lives Matter movement and the increasing calls for racial justice, the industry began to change. Major fashion houses faced criticism for their lack of diversity, and magazines like Harper's Bazaar, Elle, Town and Country featured Black women like Beyonce, Cardi B, and Kerry Washington on their covers in September 2020. This shift underscores the importance of, media representation reflecting attitudes towards race and diversity. And the story of Fanny Eaton, born in Jamaica in 1835 and featured in numerous paintings in Victorian England, and also which basically challenged at that time conventional beauty standards, highlighting the presence of Black individuals in British society long before the Windrush generation, kind of echoing what, Joanne said about Black people were here prior to the Windrush. And her story signifies the need of diverse representation. And because she's kind of an unknown hidden figure, not many people know about her, I really wanted to highlight her story. And in fact, last year, Google did a doodle on their website. Then there's other key women that you should know about. I know the slides are going to be sent out, so there's more information in the book, but also in the notes section of the slides. So I should know how to pronounce her surname. I don't want to her first name, I don't want to butcher it, but Danzabel Matilda Sante. She was a nurse, and it you know, when you typically think of Black British history figures, you typically think of Walter Tall or Mary Seacole, but this is an additional story about Black contributions in the NHS system, and more of her story can be found in the book, as well as the note section in this PowerPoint. The next slide, please. You have Rose Hudson, Hudson Wilkin, who's made significant impact in terms of the religious sector in section of society in Britain. And again, more of her story can be found in the book. Next slide. You've got Cicely Faye Allen. She was the first Black female police officer, and great to kind of slip in if you teach crime and punishment at GCSE. Next, please. Olive Morris, who is, you know, a civil rights activist. When you think of civil rights, it's typically the American story, think of Rosa Parks or, you know, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, but Olive Morris gives an additional lens into Black British civil rights movement, along with Claudia Jones, who Joanne mentioned before. She, you know, fought for Black rights through writing, and she helped set up a Notting Hill Carnival. And again, more of her story can be found in the book and within the notes section. On the next slide, please. And I just thought, most of us on here are teachers. I just wanted to give you some practical tips as to how you can insert their stories into your curriculum. So number one, you could create an inquiry unit. So it could be, what do their stories reveal about the impact that Black women had made over time in Britain? I just saw a grammatical mistake, so sorry guys. Or a her story unit, explain how 3 women from history broke the mold. And you could use, you know, the traditional stories of Black Cleopatra, Empress Matilda, but also being conscious to slip in these Black female historical figures into the curriculum. If you don't want to create a whole new inquiry, another easy way to do that is through, next slide please, is through simply just inserting, you know, their stories into homework tasks or into your units that you already teach. So insert them into units you already teach in lesson, or meanwhile someone else. I know a lot of history departments currently do a meanwhile elsewhere as like an additional lens of history and incorporating a global perspective, but you could do a meanwhile someone else. For example, Cicely Faye, who was the first Black female police officer, could nicely fit in easily to crime and punishment. Olive Morris and Claudia Jones fits nicely into a migration unit or Black or British civil rights unit. And Isabel Matilda Sante's story fits nicely into a medicine through time unit, which is typically taught at Key Stage 3. And if you want, you know, resources for, you know, BAME women into your stories, Alistair MacDonald on Twitter, he's created a bank of resources, and I'll put the link at the bottom there. And here's an example of Dido Bell's story that students could, you know, research if they were studying the French Revolution, for example. The next one quickly. Sorry. Just things to bear in mind when, you know, teaching or introducing Black female figures into the curriculum is colorism, for example. It's not something that we typically think of as educators, but as, you know, colorism perpetuates Eurocentric beauty standards. Therefore, the lighter skin you are, the more preferable you are, which has a negative impact on darker skinned women who may face this additional prejudice, impacting their self-esteem and identity. And media often perpetuates colorism by favouring lighter skinned Black women. Therefore, the curriculum can also act as an additional tool to break this, and how it could be simply auditing your curriculum to see that you've got, you know, darker skinned women or darker skinned men, for example, making a significant impact. So just kind of being conscious about that, because sometimes darker women is associated with negativity or not seen to be the desirable figure. And also regional diversity. It's very easy to build a London-centric curriculum, especially when trying to implement diversity, but also showing that, you know, there are Black people living in Wales, in Scotland, they have different accents than the London accent up north, and showing that actually the countryside also belongs to Black people, and it doesn't just belong to a white space. And I've got lots of resources on that, so you can feel free to get in touch with me in regards to that. And then finally, next slide. So my next steps when I finished sabbatical, is incorporating more Somalian history. I've been around students, Black students, which is sad to say, but don't really see Somalians as, Blacks. They think that they are Asian, but they're actually Black. They're, Somalians in Africa. So also incorporating their faces into my curriculum, and their stories. And that's a book that came out in 2021, I believe, that will help kickstart that. So that is everything for me. But if you've got any further questions, please feel free to reach out, and more of the stories can be found in the Black British History book.
Thank you so much, Emily. And as we said earlier, the slides, we're able to send out the slides as well as the recording when that's ready. And there's so much information there. And obviously with the textbooks that we've shared, you will also have resources, you have questions, as well as extracts to explore. And those of you who are English teachers, I'm sure that you will have taken much of that rich description of how Ola was able to put together her research to make almost like a creative writing unit almost, exactly what you said about thinking about what was the time like. So as teachers, you may use film, you may use some historical information, and then using that, putting that together to do a creative writing piece, or of course, using still images as the stimulus to doing a piece of creative writing, which is based around history, that your students can use towards, for example, practice for their English language paper, section B, or it could form the part of a really rich unit of work at Key Stage 3 as well. So we've come to the point of our session. We're going to have some questions. Now, I know that some of you sent in questions prior to the session, or you may have some questions in the chat. So I'm going to hand over to my lovely colleague she's got all of the questions ready. And I think we could probably take one each if we have time, perhaps starting with Ola, if it is directed towards her, that would be wonderful. Thank you.
Hiya. Thank you so much for such an interesting discussion. That's really been incredibly inspiring and really, really helpful. So I think the first one that we have for Ola is a question about your next project. So kind of, have you got something in the works? It all feels really exciting. It'd be really nice to hear if you've got anything that you're able to share.
My next book will actually be a contemporary romance, so it's yeah, it'll be more modern. It won't necessarily be historical, but after that, then I'm going back to historical fiction. And that will be thinking about working on something that talks about pre-independence Nigeria and a kind of family dealing with the whole social political situation going on in Nigeria that's gone on since independence, and I really want to explore that, having lived 17 years there if I came back. So there's just so much to explore. It's such a rich country in terms of its culture, in terms of the whole social political system. There's so many things. It's very nuanced, and I can do a lot with that as a writer. That's me.
Amazing. We'll watch this space and keep an eye out for your next books. So next, I think this could be for either Joanne or Emily, so whoever kind of wants to field it, or both. I kind of agree with this. I was looking at the comments on the Guardian Instagram post, and there's quite a mix of responses to the results to the survey, and a lot of them echoing the points that the three of you have made today about education and kind of how that's the only real way to tackle this, and also some people genuinely asking kind of who really didn't have a clue about Black British presence before Windrush. Oh, the lights have just gone off in my meeting room. There we go. So it was kind of really interesting to hear again about Ivory Bangle Lady and things like that. But if so many people are kind of agreeing on the need for improved education about Black British history, kind of what are the biggest challenges that teachers are facing, do you think, in trying to diversify history and kind of English and literature narratives that are taught in schools? Because I think there's a lot of appetite for it, but it's obviously really quite difficult.
I definitely would say time. You know, teachers are, you know, bogged down with a lot of things. It's time. It's confidence. You know, we've received even myself as a Black woman, I've received a colonized education, and I too have to kind of ensure that I'm kind of giving it out decolonized, you know, and be conscious of what I'm teaching and the way that I'm teaching things as well. So so confidence, I would definitely say that, the lack of knowledge, and also exam boards. I know, for example, OCR A level have designed this new papers on African kingdoms, but still there's limited uptake because teachers don't have that confidence despite OCR giving CPD. And Edexcel, for example, as well as other examples for GCSE, have done, you know, created migration paper. And I love Edexcel's migration unit because it specifically looks at Notting Hill and the story of Claudia Jones, Olive Morris, and so on. So I think, yeah, those three things hinder, I guess, more uptake. But then again, there's not much of an excuse, in honesty, because everything's provided. You've got the English book that Joanne has written. You know, I've co-authored the Black British History resource. So things are out there, but I think it either boils down to time or it could just be laziness. So yeah.
That's really interesting. We've got one comment in the chat. So yeah, what do you think is the impact of historical fiction like Ola's being published? Thinking of books like Patterson, I'm not sure if I've got that right, Johnson's The Secret Diaries of Charles Ignatius Sancho, or the Lizzie and Bell mystery series for children. Don't know whether you've seen kind of the impact of that in your classrooms, or whether you've kind of been inspired by other authors in that space.
I picked up a copy of Patterson Joseph's Ignatius Sancho's book on Saturday. I've been hearing a lot of good things about it, and you know, I think the more books like that come out, they might even find their way into films or, you know, the theatre. And I think the more of them come out like that, it's combating the rhetoric, it's combating ignorance, and it's as long as it can find its way into the school curriculum, it just provides a different kind of narrative than the one that we've all grown up with. And yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing more books like that coming out. You know, there's a lot of books about, and all those books are fine, about, you know, crime and magical realism and things like that. But historical fiction is also something that more people need to go into as well, to tell our stories. The stories of our parents, the story of our grandparents. As Joanne said, you don't necessarily have to be famous for someone to hear about your story. We're surrounded by heroes, and some of them were our mums and dads and our grandparents. So we need to hear more of those stories, because if we don't tell those stories, who will? You know, so that's it.
Yeah, I'd just like to add to that, definitely. I was watching the Pride of Britain Windrush special, and the stories, in particular the Bristol bus boycott. In my mind, I was imagining that would be an amazing film, you know, that somebody could actually, you know, put together that as a project, because it not only involved activism, fighting against prejudice at the time, but also we saw allies at work, that, you know, that they were able to have those conversations with their white friends and neighbours who also joined the call. And I think actually, yes, we I've seen some great movies about Rosa Parks, but wouldn't it be amazing to have a film or a TV series which was about the Bristol bus boycott? And Bristol is often a place actually that people do reference. We know even during Black Lives Matter, it was the focus of a lot of attention. There are many cities and towns across the UK that have very rich histories connected to the Black population that would be phenomenal as creative vehicles.
Yeah.
Great.
Do we have another question at all? I'm not sure if it was in the chat or that was sent in. We've probably got time for another one or two.
Yeah. So we've got another comment in the chat saying there's also Walker Marshall's Black British History is available as well if anyone else is looking for recommendations. One that I'd had come in was, can you talk about the importance of representation in literature curriculum and the wider media, particularly for young people? So I guess the research that we've discussed a bit today was kind of focused on adults and what they do or don't know. But yeah, it would be interesting to hear kind of from the educator's perspective on the impact of that representation in the classroom.
I think some of you will have heard of the Missing Pages campaign, which was a TeachFirst campaign, which looked at the fact that young people had not read a book by a Black author ever. And there was a lot of lobbying and a lot of support to get the exam boards to change their set text list. And now we have 3 Black authors which feature in the English literature set texts, and this is the biggest exam board in the country. And to know that, teachers, like 75% of the teachers that were surveyed really wanted to have a diverse curriculum, but they didn't, because it wasn't on the set text list, then that meant they didn't have the time, they didn't have the resources, they were not able to kind of fight for diverse literature being part of their programs of study. So seeing that has now changed, we have Lit in Colour, which is Penguin, they have a whole series of books. So young people are not only able to see themselves represented in stories, but children who are in schools that are not diverse get an opportunity to read stories, to study plays which are written by diverse authors, and to give them an insight into lives that perhaps that they're not surrounded by, to make them ready to be global citizens. So young people are just not, we don't want them just to be ready to work in their own town or city. We want them to have that, a greater understanding of all people, and having diverse texts and literature makes a huge difference. And aside from that, getting young people to recognize that actually I could make a living being a writer. There is somebody that looks like me. So if we think about poets, like even you could think of Lem Sisse, you could think of, Caleb Femi, you could think there's so many writers around now, young Black writers as well. And for a young Black person in the classroom to see somebody that's probably not even that much older than them, who writes for a living and knows that passion that they have for literature is something that they could really channel all of their energies into, I think is priceless.
Totally agree. I'm afraid we're probably going to have to wrap it up there. So I don't know whether the 3 of you had anything more that you wanted to say.
Ola, would you like to give a closing sentence, and Emily?
Oh, okay. I'll just second what you said. I grew up at a time when the books I was reading in the early 70s at school, there was no one in those books that looked like me, and that was one of the things that made me want to really be a writer. So representation is really very, very important. The whole idea, and then I used to dream as a kid, not of just wanting to be a writer, but walking into a bookstore and seeing someone that looked like me on the cover. And like 40 years later, because I can see that happening. It just so that if there's a little kid out there like me, then they could see that and say, you know, there's someone that looks like me out there in books, and it does matter a lot. And that's.
Thank you so much. And Emily?
My closing remarks is don't be afraid to make changes. I remember in primary school, I have a similar story to Ola in the fact that I was fostered, and my foster family were white, and we lived in Bristol, so I didn't have any connection, and I was really young, so I didn't have any connection with my culture or with my colour, in honesty, until my teacher, Miss Lovenbury, said, I should be teaching you this, and taught a lesson on Martin Luther King. And because she was just passionate about civil rights, and although it wasn't a Black British historical figure, it did start my love for history. And she didn't, you know, divert from the curriculum and taught what she was passionate about and what she believed in. I wouldn't be here talking to you today if that makes sense. So don't be afraid to make changes. Don't be afraid to make mistakes if you have to, but take that step, I definitely would say. And there's so much networks out there whereby you can ask questions, and you can get the resources as well. Yeah.
So that brings our session to a close. Thank you so much, Emily and Ola and the team from Collins for supporting this wonderful discussion today, all about our stories, our history. And so if you have an idea, if this has inspired you, then we've got great advice that's been given by all of our speakers. Get writing, get talking to people, get researching. Thank you so much. I hope you have a wonderful evening. And this has been a fabulous end to Black History Month. But remember, every month is Black History Month. Goodbye, everyone.